And so the city became a kind of scripture for him, each street a verse, each passerby a line in a larger poem he could not fully read yet somehow understood. When he carried the bundles tucked under his arm, the rough paper still smelling of ink and oil, he felt as though he carried not mere words but seeds, fragile and potent, meant for soil he might never see. Sometimes, as he slid a folded page beneath a door or pressed one into a stranger's hand, he caught the flicker of something in their eyes, a hesitation, a widening, a secret recognition, as if they too had inhaled that smoke of old promises and felt its warmth in their lungs. But it was not always light. Shadows grew where light did, and in the narrow alleys Imran sometimes noticed faces too still, eyes lingering too long. Musa warned him in gruff tones that men had been taken for less. "Keep your head down, boy. Paper is heavier than iron when the wrong hands weigh it." Imran nodded, but inside he knew that what he carried could not be hidden forever. Nights came when he lay awake listening to the hum of the city. Motorbikes growling, radios muttering love songs, dogs barking at unseen shapes, and beneath it all, that deeper hum, the vow moving like a river through stone. He would remember Marcus's steady gaze, Anne's laughter like defiance, Cale's weary courage, and he would feel them beside him, not as ghosts but as continuities of breath. Sometimes he whispered their names into the darkness, not to call them back but to keep their echoes alive. One evening, as the sky burned with harmattan dust, he found himself lingering at the edge of the market where women's voices rose sharp as bells. A little girl darted through the stalls, clutching one of the handbills he had delivered the week before. She waved it like a flag, laughing, her bare feet slapping the ground. No one stopped her, though some shook their heads, others smiled faintly. Imran stood frozen, a strange trembling in his chest. The words he had helped press into being had already slipped beyond him, carried by smaller, swifter hands into the living current of the city. And in that moment, he understood something new. The vow was not a burden he bore alone, nor a fire he had to guard single-handed. It was already multiplying, scattering like sparks in dry grass, finding new breath where he least expected. His task was only to keep walking, to keep tending, to keep trusting that even the smallest ember, once lit, could set a world ablaze. And the days pressed forward, each one threaded with the same rhythm yet never quite the same, as though time itself was weaving him into a pattern larger than his sight could hold. At the press, Musa's muttering grew harsher, the machines more temperamental, but Imran found in their clatter a kind of heartbeat, steady and inexorable, a sound that stitched him to the present even as his mind drifted toward the vow. He began to notice small things that once passed him by, the way the dust motes danced in the shafts of light that slipped through the cracked roof, the way the ink bled unevenly at the edges of letters, as if the words themselves resisted being contained. He carried those bundles through the streets with more than duty now. He carried them with reverence. Each page felt like a fragile wing, and he was careful in his steps as though the whole city's breath depended on his hands. In the alleys, children sometimes tugged at his shirt, asking for scraps of paper to fold into boats or kites, and Imran gave freely, smiling at their laughter even as he wondered what truths their play concealed. Perhaps one day they would unfold those scraps and see words, and the words would see them back, and something in their lives would shift. Yet even as the vow pulsed warmly within him, danger edged closer, like a shadow growing with the setting sun. Twice, he noticed men lingering near the press, their eyes flat and watchful. Once, a woman in the market refused the handbill he offered, whispering hurriedly, "Careful, boy. They are listening everywhere." Imran felt the weight of her warning but did not falter. Fear could not root him now. It could only remind him of the cost of silence. At night, he dreamed of fire. Not destructive fire, but a fire that leapt from page to page, from mouth to mouth, until the city itself glowed like an ember seen from the heavens. He woke with his chest tight, sweat cooling on his skin, and lay listening to the faint crackle of the vow, like coals refusing to die out. And when the dawn came, pale and uncertain, he rose with a steadiness that surprised him. He was no longer merely delivering papers. He was delivering continuity, a secret inheritance that had passed from hands long gone into his own. One morning, Musa caught him staring too long at a freshly printed sheet. The old man slammed his hand on the table, smearing ink across his palm. "Boy," Musa growled, Do not look so hard at the words. They will look back, and you may not like what you see. But Imran only bowed his head, hiding the quiet flame that refused to dim. And so it was that he walked on, day after day, through markets loud with bargaining, through alleys thick with dust, through nights trembling with secrets, carrying more than he could name. The vow was no longer only memory. It was motion, it was breath, it was a current that would not let him go. And though he did not know where it would carry him, he knew he could not turn away. And so the watchers came closer, not with the bluntness of soldiers but with the patience of hunters. At first, Imran only felt them, the prickle at the back of his neck, the stillness that fell too suddenly in a crowded lane. Then he saw them, faces that did not belong, eyes that skimmed over stalls and doorways only to return, again and again, to him. They never approached, never spoke, but their silence pressed heavier than words. Musa noticed too, though he said little. Only once, when Imran lingered too long at the shop's threshold, did Musa snap, head down, hands working. Ink cannot betray you if you don't let your face give you away. Still, even as danger breathed at his back, the vow within him did not shrink. If anything, it sharpened. The bundles he carried seemed to hum louder, each folded sheet a pulse in his hands. He delivered them with greater care, sliding them beneath doors at dawn, leaving them on benches by the roadside, pressing them quietly into palms that trembled before closing tight around them. He saw what it did to people, the widening of eyes, the quick dart of a glance over the shoulder, the slight nod, the sudden stillness that meant the words had landed. The vow was moving, leaping, spreading, alive in the breath of strangers. One evening, he turned into a narrow alley to avoid the market patrols. The air smelled of rust and frying oil, and a cat hissed from a broken wall. Ahead, a boy no older than himself waited, leaning against the crumbling plaster. Imran's first thought was that he, too, was a watcher. But when their eyes met, the boy tapped his chest once, lightly, as though marking his own heartbeat. Then he whispered, "For the fire." Imran froze. The word struck him like an echo from a voice he had never heard yet somehow remembered. Before he could answer, the boy slipped past him, disappearing into the dark, leaving only the scrape of footsteps fading into the city's hum. For the fire. The phrase stayed with him, turning over and over in his mind like an ember refusing to cool. It was not only he who carried the vow. Others were awake. Others were moving. That night, he returned to the press late, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands trembling as though the words themselves burned through his skin. Musa looked up, eyes narrowing. "What did you see?" the old man asked, though his tone made it sound more like a command than a question. Imran hesitated, then whispered, "Another spark." For the first time, Musa's face softened, the weight of years bending into something almost like pride. He said nothing more, only nodded once, as if to say, "Yes, boy. It has begun." And from then on, Imran knew that the vow was no longer a secret buried in him. It was a river breaking its banks, and he was caught in its flood. And the flood did not wait. It pushed him further each day, until even the streets he once knew by heart felt altered, trembling with unseen currents. When he carried his bundles, he no longer walked as a boy with ink-stained hands. He walked as one woven into something larger, though no one else could name it aloud. He saw it in the flickers, a mother pretending to scold her child while sliding a folded sheet into her basket, a driver humming too loudly as he tucked a pamphlet beneath his seat, a tailor who slipped a page into the lining of a jacket before hanging it up for collection. The vow was multiplying, disguising itself in ordinary acts, and Imran felt both wonder and dread at the speed of its spread. But the watchers grew bolder too. Once, as he turned a corner, he found one standing square in his path, arms folded, eyes unreadable. The man did nothing, said nothing, but Imran felt his body lock, his breath thin. Then, after a silence that felt like a lifetime, the man stepped aside, letting him pass. It was worse than confrontation, worse than capture, for it told Imran that they knew and that they were waiting. Nights thickened with fear. In his cot above the press, Imran often lay listening for footsteps on the stairs, for the crash of fists against the door. But even as fear gnawed at him, the vow thrummed louder. He remembered the boy in the alley, the whispered words, "For the fire." He repeated them to himself in the dark, as if they were a shield. And sometimes, in the half-light between waking and sleep, he imagined the fire already burning, rooftops glowing with a hidden flame no hand could extinguish. One evening, while gathering the printed sheets, Imran paused. His hands, black with ink, trembled over the paper. He thought of Marcus, of Cale, of the ones who had carried before him, and he felt a sudden clarity. This path would not spare him. Sooner or later, the watchers would close in. His safety, his quiet life, even his own beating heart, none were guaranteed. Yet in that same breath came certainty. He would not stop. If the vow demanded his whole self, then he would give it. Better to burn in the fire than to live as ash. When he looked up, Musa was watching him, eyes sharp as knives. For a long moment the old man said nothing. Then, with a voice rough but steady, he murmured, "So, you've chosen." And Imran, though his throat was dry, bowed his head and whispered back, "I have." Outside, the city roared with its usual noise, cars, radios, laughter, cries. But beneath it all Imran felt the pulse of the vow surging like a storm about to break. And so the tension grew not in sudden bursts of violence or in the sharp crack of confrontation, but in the slow and steady thickening of the air, the way a storm announces itself first through heaviness in the sky, through silence in the birds, through a pressure that presses on the skin before even a single drop of rain falls. And Imran felt that heaviness in everything now. The clatter of the printing press was louder, more insistent. The ink seemed to carry a darker sheen. The streets themselves seemed to lean closer as he walked with his bundles, every corner alive with possibility, every passing glance a question. And yet life continued outwardly as it always had, women bargaining in the market with voices sharp as bells, children running barefoot through puddles left by the night rain, drivers leaning from bus windows to curse the traffic, radios spilling love songs into the hot night. But underneath it all, under every surface, under every gesture, there was something else, a hum that had begun quietly and now grew stronger with each passing day, the vow running like a hidden current through the city, invisible yet undeniable, and Imran, though still a boy in years, felt himself part of that current, not steering it but carried by it, pulled deeper into its course. And the watchers, too, were there. Closer now, sometimes so close he could almost hear the fabric of their jackets as they shifted their weight, sometimes standing at corners too still, too deliberate, their eyes never on him directly but always on the space he occupied. And Musa saw it too, though the old man spoke less now, his muttering more guarded, his hands moving over the press with a mechanical urgency. And once when Imran lingered too long watching the sheets dry, Musa snapped, not in anger but in fear disguised as roughness. "Do not stand still, boy, do not let the words trap you where they lie, keep your hands moving, for stillness is a crack they can slip through." And Imran obeyed, though he could not stop the way his eyes caught the ink shimmering in the light, as if the words themselves were alive, lifting from paper into breath, ready to be inhaled by anyone brave enough. And he carried those words out, day after day, sliding them beneath doors at dawn, leaving them folded on benches, tucking them into the hands of men and women who barely dared meet his gaze. And each time he did he felt the vow pull stronger, not only in him but in them. For there were signs now that others carried it too, subtle but sure, a nod too quick in a crowd, a phrase whispered low at the market, a scrap of paper folded into a child's pocket. And though fear walked beside him, though the watcher's shadows lengthened, though Musa's warnings pressed like weights on his chest, he could not deny the fire growing. Under it all, the fire that had been passed to him by Marcus and Anne and Cale, the fire that refused to die. And sometimes at night when he lay on his cot in the press-room, the air thick with the smell of ink and oil, he whispered the words he had heard from the boy in the alley, "For the fire." And he felt less alone, as if unseen voices whispered them back to him across the city, across time, across silence itself. And it gave him courage to rise again at dawn, to shoulder the bundles, to walk the streets with eyes lowered but heart awake. And the city seemed to know him now, seemed to press against him, testing his resolve, the rain falling heavier, the nights longer, the alleys darker, but in those very shadows he sometimes caught glimpses of sparks, not literal flames but sudden shifts in faces, the tightening of a jaw, the widening of eyes, A mother who slipped a sheet into her apron and kept bargaining without pause. A tailor who stitched words into the lining of a jacket. A driver who kept humming too loudly as he slid a folded page under his seat. And Imran knew then that the vow was no longer only his to carry. It had become a chorus, though still muted, a song sung under the breath of the city, and he was only one note, trembling but necessary. And yet with every day the watchers tightened their net, not through arrests or open threats but through presence, their silence heavier than words, their stillness louder than shouts, and Imran felt it pressing closer, even in the quiet of dawn, even in the laughter of children, even in the smell of roasted groundnuts on the roadside. And he began to understand that tension is its own kind of battle, that waiting is a war, that endurance is an act of defiance, and so he endured, he carried, he whispered, he burned quietly, knowing the fire was spreading underground, knowing the storm would break in its own time, and all he could do, all he must do, was remain awake, remain steadfast, remain a thread in the fabric that refused to tear, and so the days lengthened into weeks, and the weeks into months, and still the vow hummed through him, stronger now, heavier now, more dangerous and yet more beautiful than he could have ever imagined, and he walked on, carrying words that were no longer paper but sparks, no longer silent but singing, and though the watcher's eyes grew sharper, though Musa's warnings grew sterner, though fear sat heavier in his chest, Imran knew with a certainty beyond doubt that he would not turn back, for the vow had already claimed him, and in its fire he was no longer small, no longer alone, but infinite. And the weeks stretched into a season, and the season bent into another, each day, layering itself upon the last like sheets of paper stacked high, so that sometimes Imran wondered if his life was nothing more than words pressed into pages, stacked until they formed a tower that could either stand against the wind or collapse beneath its own weight. And still he rose each dawn, washing his ink-stained hands that never quite came clean, carrying bundles warm from the press into streets that smelled of dust and diesel, weaving through markets alive with bargaining voices, through alleys humming with gossip, through courtyards where children shouted as though the world were theirs alone, and with each step he felt the watchers closer, not in sight always but in wait, the way silence gathers before thunder, and Musa muttered darker things now, his eyes darting more often to the corners of the shop, his voice dropping to a rasp when he warned, "Do not trust the quiet, boy, the quiet is a mouth waiting to swallow you." And Imran nodded though he knew the vow left him no choice, for the vow was not something to be obeyed or disobeyed, it was not an order, it was not even a duty, it was a current that carried him whether he willed it or not, a pulse running through his veins that made stillness impossible, and so he walked, carrying sheets that fluttered like secret wings in his arms, slipping them into cracks of doors, under stools and tea stalls, into the hands of strangers whose fingers trembled but closed firmly once the paper touched them, and sometimes he caught the flash of recognition in their eyes, the brief flare of courage lit and quickly hidden, and he knew the vow was alive, moving not only through words but through breath, through glances, through gestures as ordinary as lifting a basket or nodding at a driver, and he knew he was not alone though solitude pressed on him like heat, and at night when he lay on his cot listening to the city hum, the rumble of buses, the whine of radios, the bark of dogs, the sigh of wind through half-shuttered windows, he whispered the phrase he had heard from the boy in the alley, "For the fire," and though no answer came, he felt the echo none the less, as if the city itself whispered it back to him in the rustle of leaves, in the hiss of oil and frying pans, in the soft thud of footsteps fading down stairwells, and he clung to that echo like a rope, pulling him through the darkness of each night into the fragile light of morning. And in the press Musa worked him harder now, demanding speed, demanding silence, demanding focus, yet sometimes, when he thought Imran was not looking, the old man's eyes softened, and once, late at night, after the machines had clattered to stillness and the air was heavy with ink, Musa said only, "It grows," and Imran did not ask what he meant, for he already knew, the vow was no longer seed but root, no longer whisper but murmur, spreading underground through channels invisible, until the whole city seemed to carry a hidden rhythm beneath its surface noise, and the watchers felt it too. Imran could see it in the way they lingered longer, in the way their faces tightened, in the way their silence sharpened, and still they did not strike, as though waiting for him to stumble, waiting for the vow to reveal itself fully, and the waiting was its own form of terror, yet also its own form of strength, for in that suspended space the vow only grew stronger, invisible yet unstoppable, and Imran felt his own fear transform into a strange calm, a quiet acceptance that he was already beyond safety, beyond retreat, that his life was no longer his to guard but his to spend, like a coin already placed on the table, and so he moved through his days with a steadiness that surprised even him, greeting children who asked for scraps of paper to fold into boats, nodding at the women who haggled in the market with their sharp voices, walking past the drivers who cursed the traffic yet hummed softly as though carrying secret tunes, and while he carried the vow like a lantern hidden under his shirt, its flame invisible but warming his chest, and sometimes he wondered what Marcus would say if he could see him now, or Anne or Cale, and in those thoughts he felt them close, not as ghosts but as continuities, as breaths still moving in the air, and he realized that memory itself was part of the vow, that to remember was to keep alive, and so he remembered, even as he pressed new words onto new pages, even as he delivered them into hands he might never see again, and he felt the city becoming scripture, each street a verse, each face a line, each silence a space between words, and though the watchers prowled its margins, the text of the city was already written in ink they could not erase, and so Imran walked on, carrying not pamphlets but sparks, not bundles but breath, not duty but destiny, and the days lengthened, and the vow deepened, and the tension swelled like the sky before rain, and though he did not know when the storm would break, he knew that he would not turn away when it came, for he had already chosen, he had already given himself, he had already become fire waiting for air. And so the vow lived in him like breath itself, moving through his body, through the paper in his hands, through the streets he walked, through the faces that glanced at him quickly and then away, and time folded over itself until days no longer felt separate but rather threads woven into a cloth of tension, each thread humming with the same hidden electricity, for everywhere he went there was a double meaning now, a double vision, the world of ordinary noise and the world of secret fire, and Imran carried them both at once, his ears ringing with the clatter of Musa's press, with the bargaining of women in the markets, with the laughter of children chasing each other down dusty alleys. Yet beneath it all he heard the vow, a subterranean hum, a rhythm that did not relent, and he felt himself stretched between the visible and the invisible, between the paper in his hands and the flame in his chest. And sometimes the tension was almost unbearable. Sometimes he wished he could set the bundles down and walk away into silence, into anonymity, into a life where no one watched, where no vow pressed at his ribs, but then he would see it again, that spark in someone's eyes, that subtle shift of posture when a sheet of paper touched their hand, that quick intake of breath as they realized the words were not dead but alive, alive with memory, alive with promise, alive with defiance, and he knew he could not walk away. For it was no longer about him, no longer about choice, it was about continuity, about the unbroken thread that reached back through Marcus and Anne and Cale and further still through countless names he did not know, and that stretched forward into the lives of children yet unborn, and he was one bead on that thread, necessary though small, and the watchers knew it too, which is why their presence grew heavier, more suffocating, though still they did not act openly, they hovered at the edges of streets, leaned against walls with eyes half-shuttered but sharp, lingered at tea stalls pretending to sip slowly, and Imran felt their gaze like pins against his skin, but still they waited, as if trying to measure not just him but the whole current moving beneath the city, as if even they feared striking too soon and scattering embers into a blaze beyond control, and Musa said less than ever, his muttering becoming silence, his silence becoming weight, but sometimes, late at night when the press had fallen still, Imran caught him staring into the empty paper trays as though he saw ghosts written there, and once, without looking at Imran, he said, "It will not be long," and his voice carried no hope and no despair, only certainty, and Imran did not ask what he meant because he already knew, and still he carried, each morning rising before the sun, washing the ink from his hands though it never left completely, hoisting the bundles warm with fresh words, and stepping into streets where the air seemed to vibrate with expectation, and each delivery became a ritual, sliding a folded sheet under a cracked door, leaving one atop a market stall, tucking another into the pocket of a jacket hanging for sale, each act small and invisible yet heavy with consequence. And sometimes he saw what happened after. How a woman would glance around quickly before snatching the paper up and hiding it in her scarf, how a driver would slip it under his seat and hum louder, how a tailor would pause at his sewing machine just long enough to fold it neatly into a jacket lining, and these small gestures were like flames passed from hand to hand, from breath to breath, and Imran felt them warming the city beneath its noise, and yet with each passing week the watchers pressed closer, shadows thickening, silences deepening, until the very air seemed to vibrate with the closeness of eruption, and Imran began to dream of fire, not fire that destroyed but fire that revealed, fire that lit up every hidden corner, fire that made every unseen vow visible, and he would wake drenched in sweat, his chest pounding, whispering for the fire into the dark as though speaking it aloud could hold the vision at bay, and sometimes in the market he would hear echoes of that phrase, slipped under the breath of a passer-by, woven into bargaining words, disguised as laughter, and each time he heard it he felt less alone, felt the network tightening around him, not of watchers but of sparks, unseen but everywhere, and he knew that though he walked solitary, he was not solitary, though he carried the bundles with his own arms, countless others were carrying them too, carrying the vow in their own hidden ways, and the thought steadied him, gave him the courage to endure the waiting, the tension, the silence that pressed harder each day, because he knew waiting was not emptiness, it was gathering, it was gestation, it was the breath before speech, and though his fear never left him, it followed him into every alley, every dream. He learned to walk with it, to let it sharpen rather than blunt him, to let it remind him of the stakes, and so the vow and the fear lived side by side in him, two fires that refused to extinguish one another, and still the city moved as though nothing had changed, buses groaning through traffic, radios playing love songs, children flying paper kites, women balancing baskets on their heads, men shouting at each other over spilled groundnuts. And yet beneath all that ordinariness Imran felt the undercurrent, stronger each day, until he could no longer tell where his own heartbeat ended and the city's began, and he realized that this too was the vow's work, to bind him not only to the past and the future but to the present, to every life around him, to the breath of strangers, to the hum of markets, to the rustle of trees, and in that binding he felt infinite even as he felt hunted, vast even as he felt cornered, and though he did not know when the watchers would finally act, he knew he would not falter when they did, for the vow had already remade him, and he was no longer only Imran, boy with ink-stained hands. He was Imran, thread in the fabric, ember in the fire, spark in the storm that had not yet broken but surely would, and so he walked on, day after day, through dust and rain, through noise and silence, through fear and fire, carrying words that were not merely words but living things, carrying a vow that was not merely memory but eternity, and though the city above still pretended nothing had changed, the city below, the city hidden, the city humming with quiet fire, was already awake, already alive, already waiting to rise, and in that waiting, in that breath held by thousands, Imran walked steady, Imran walked certain, Imran walked infinite. Imran moved through the city like a shadow among shadows, the dust clinging to his sandals, the smells of roasted corn, kerosene, and damp concrete threading through the air, and every step he took seemed to echo with meaning even when no one else turned to look, for though the people bustled in their daily rhythm, hawkers crying out over tomatoes and peppers, bus conductors slapping the sides of their danfos, tailors humming beside clattering sewing machines, he felt something invisible pulsing beneath all of it, like a hidden drumbeat that kept time with his heart, a rhythm no one acknowledged aloud but that guided their eyes and their silences, and he knew the vow was there, alive, breathing, waiting, and so he carried it forward in every folded sheet of paper Musa pressed into his arms, every whispered phrase that slipped between teeth like contraband, every sidelong glance from strangers who said nothing but seemed to know everything. And yet even as the fire spread quietly, the watchers thickened like smoke around him, their presence no longer just at the edges but now woven directly into the fabric of his days. For in the market he noticed the same tall man pretending to buy yams 3 days in a row, in the alley by Musa's press, he glimpsed the glint of a cigarette that vanished the instant he turned, and once on the bus he caught his reflection in the window and behind it, faint but undeniable, the gaze of someone not looking at the road but only at him, and these fragments pressed down on him like a storm about to break, but still no thunder fell, and the waiting itself became almost unbearable, for tension can carve deeper wounds than violence, stretching every second into a blade, and Imran felt himself sharpened, refined, honed by the silent pressure, until even his dreams were no longer his own but full of watchers with eyeless faces, full of papers that burst into flame the moment he touched them, full of Musa's voice reciting words he could not understand, but which left him waking drenched in sweat, clutching the edges of his mat, whispering the vow into the dark just to steady himself, and still, when morning came, he rose, washed the ink from his hands though it clung like memory, hoisted the bundles still damp with fresh words, and stepped into the streets with a steadiness that was half courage and half surrender, for he knew he had no other path. The vow had claimed him entirely. And the vow did not allow retreat, and each delivery was both burden and release. Each hidden sheet a spark passed forward, and though sometimes his chest tightened with fear when his hand slid a folded page into a crack in the wall or beneath the corner of a market stall, that fear was always followed by a flicker of something deeper, something like joy, for he could almost hear the words breathing after he left them, could almost feel them rooting into soil he would never see. And it was this invisible harvest that kept him moving, that steadied him. When silence pressed too heavy, and slowly he began to notice how the city itself seemed to lean closer, how people's laughter cut shorter when certain phrases passed, how conversations in tea stalls would dip into sudden hushes just as he approached, and how sometimes, though no one touched him, he felt a brush of recognition in the air, a communion that needed no words. And once in the market an old woman with faded eyes brushed past him and pressed a groundnut into his palm without speaking. And though it seemed nothing, he knew it was not nothing. He knew it was a recognition, a blessing, a quiet acknowledgment that the fire was seen, and these small signs multiplied, subtle yet undeniable, so that the weight of watchers was balanced by the weight of unseen allies, and he began to understand that this was the true work of the vow, not the papers themselves, fragile as they were, but the threads of recognition, the invisible weaving of countless breaths into a fabric too wide to be torn. And yet with this understanding came greater danger, for the watchers, too, must have sensed the tightening net, the spreading current, and Imran felt them pressing closer, their silence heavier, their footsteps nearer, and though they still did not strike, the city trembled with the closeness of eruption, and sometimes at dusk, when the sun bled across the rooftops and the air grew thick with the smoke of evening fires, he would stand at the edge of a street and feel the weight of eyes upon him from a dozen unseen corners, and he would whisper to himself not words of fear but the vow itself, letting it roll over his tongue until it steadied his breath, for he knew that if the watchers were waiting, then he too must wait, must not falter, must not move too soon, for timing was everything, and the vow was not about haste but about endurance, and endurance required patience sharper than any blade. And so he carried on, day by day, step by step, breath by breath, the ordinary and the extraordinary woven so tightly he could no longer separate them, until even the act of buying bread felt heavy with significance. Even the sound of children's laughter in the streets seemed like a secret hymn, and he realized that this was how revolutions lived before they were named, not in great clashes but in these subtle inflections of daily life, in glances, in silences, in the refusal to forget, and in the vow that refused to die. And though the watchers still hovered like thunderclouds, and though fear still clawed at him in every shadow, Imran walked steady, Imran walked unbroken, Imran walked infinite, carrying in his ink-stained hands the weight of a city that pretended nothing had changed yet which had already, invisibly, changed forever. Imran's days unfolded like pages being written by an unseen hand, each line of routine inked with both the clarity of the ordinary and the shimmer of something more. And though the world around him moved in familiar cycles, the vendors with their cracked voices lifting above the morning rush, the hiss of frying akara in oil that spat like impatient tongues, the rattle of Danfo buses groaning under the weight of too many passengers, Moose's endless mutterings as the press churned and clattered in the back room. He felt those cycles vibrating with a hidden tension, as though the city itself were a drumhead stretched too tight, each sound a strike that might at any moment split it open. And he, caught in the middle, carried the silence of waiting like another bundle under his arm, heavier than paper yet impossible to put down, for though the vow had rooted in him as deeply as marrow and gave him strength in moments of fear, Imran's days unfolded like pages being written by an unseen hand, each line of routine inked with both the clarity of the ordinary and the shimmer of something more, and though the world around him moved in familiar cycles, the vendors with their cracked voices lifting above the morning rush, the hiss of frying akara in oil that spat like impatient tongues, the rattle of Danfo buses groaning under the weight of too many passengers, Moose's endless mutterings as the press churned and clattered in the back room. He felt those cycles vibrating with a hidden tension, as though the city itself were a drumhead stretched too tight, each sound a strike that might at any moment split it open, and he, caught in the middle, carried the silence of waiting like another bundle under his arm, heavier than paper, yet impossible to put down, for though the vow had rooted in him as deeply as marrow and gave him strength in moments of fear, Imran's life began to feel less like a line moving forward and more like a river circling on itself, always flowing, always changing, yet somehow carrying him back again and again to the same crossroads of silence and anticipation, and though the world outside remained loud with its daily commerce. The crackle of frying oil, the shrill cries of bus conductors shoving passengers into already overstuffed danfos, the laughter of children darting barefoot through narrow alleys where goats nosed at discarded wrappers. Beneath it all there thrummed a current he could not ignore, a vibration that seemed to run not only through the stones of the streets but through the marrow of his own bones, and he knew it was the vow pressing against the walls of time, pressing against the fragile silences of a city pretending that everything was as it had always been, and in this press of invisibility he felt himself stretched thin, his body moving through routines while his spirit hovered between dread and illumination, for everywhere he went now he saw signs, not open ones but gestures too small for chance. The woman at the pepper stall who, without looking, pressed the right bundle of leaves into his hand and whispered under her breath a phrase from the old promise. The boy who chased his football into Imran's path and then, grinning, muttered words that should have meant nothing but carried the rhythm of the vow. The old tailor who touched Imran's sleeve a moment too long as if to say, "I see you, I remember too," and each of these moments added threads to the unseen web tightening around him, a fabric that grew richer and more dangerous with each passing day, for the more he recognized it the more certain he became that others recognized it too, not just those who shared it but also those who hunted it, the watchers who had grown bolder in their quietness, appearing at the edges of his life like stains that would not wash away, the man who bought roasted corn from the same roadside woman each evening and never ate it, the woman in the yellow headscarf who stood too long by the newspaper stall pretending to read headlines though her eyes never moved across the page, the boy who played drafts outside Moose's print shop every day but never once moved a piece. And Imran knew these figures for what they were, not because they acted but because they did not act, their stillness louder than any gesture, their patience heavier than any blow, and the weight of their gaze became another bundle he carried, pressing into his shoulders even when his arms were empty, and yet he carried on, because the vow did not ask for safety, the vow asked only to be carried. And each time he tucked a folded pamphlet beneath a loose brick in the wall or slid it into the crack of a door at dawn when the streets were still empty of noise, he felt that same strange light bloom in his chest, that same swelling certainty that though he was small he was part of something immense, and it was this certainty that kept him walking even when his feet ached, that steadied his voice even when Moose's temper lashed him for mistakes at the press, that silenced the tremor in his hands when he glimpsed the shadow of a watcher lingering too long at the corner of the market. For Imran had begun to understand that the vow was not a shield against fear but a way of carrying it, a way of walking with fear and not letting it close his throat, and in that understanding he felt a strength deeper than courage, a strength made of endurance, the kind of strength that outlasts storms, and so he endured, day folding into day, each one the same and not the same, until time itself began to blur, weeks sliding past like drops of ink spreading into water, and in this blur he found himself more attuned to the small details, the chipped paint on a doorway, the rhythm of Moose's breathing when he finally slept, the faint smell of rain that sometimes drifted in from the west even when no clouds marked the sky, and he realized that in attending to these details he was learning the city as one learns a beloved face, every wrinkle, every scar, every shadow, and the more intimately he knew it the more clearly he felt the vow woven through it, not as something added but as something revealed, as though the vow had always been there, humming beneath the markets, thrumming beneath the rooftops, waiting only for ears to hear it. And now that he did, he could not unhear it, could not unsee the threads connecting lives that pretended not to touch, and in this awareness he sometimes felt overwhelmed, as though he were drowning in signals, every glance a message, every silence a song, and in those moments he would retreat to the roof of the press house at night, sitting with his knees drawn up beneath the stars, breathing slowly until the enormity of it settled into a quieter rhythm. And from that height the city seemed less threatening, the watchers less suffocating. For he could see lights twinkling from countless windows, each one a life carrying its own secrets, its own endurance, and he would remind himself that the vow did not belong to him alone. It was everywhere, it was everyone, it was carried in breaths he would never count, and with this reminder the weight on his chest would ease, and he would whisper the vow again, softer this time, not to defy the watchers but to affirm the others, the unseen multitude who carried it alongside him. And in this act he felt both smaller and greater, smaller because he was only one thread, greater because he was woven into something that could not be undone, and so he rose again the next morning, and the next, carrying on with his bundles, his ink-stained hands, his quiet endurance, always aware of the watchers pressing closer yet always aware, too, of the vow pressing outward, expanding like breath. And though he did not know when the silence would break or how, he knew with a certainty, deeper than bone, that when it did, he would not be alone, for the vow had already bound him to countless unseen hearts, and together they waited, together they endured, together they sharpened themselves in the stillness before the storm. Imran moved through the days with a weight of something both invisible and undeniable pressed into his chest, a heaviness that never crushed him but also never left, a presence as constant as his shadow. And though from the outside his life looked unchanged, he still rose with the dawn to wash the ink from his fingers that seemed always stained no matter how hard he scrubbed. He still carried bundles through the streets that smelled of dust and kerosene and roasted corn. He still nodded politely to neighbors who regarded him as a boy doing errands for the irritable old printer. Inside he felt as though he had stepped across an unseen line into a world layered atop the ordinary. He still carried bundles through the streets that smelled of dust and kerosene and roasted corn. He still nodded politely to neighbors who regarded him as a boy doing errands for the irritable old printer. Inside he felt as though he had stepped across an unseen line into a world layered atop the ordinary, a second world stitched into every gesture and silence, and it was this world he now inhabited most fully. For though he bargained for bread in the market, though he haggled over fares with bus conductors, though he stood in the heat of midday waiting while Musa adjusted the clattering press, he did all of it with the awareness that under the noise ran another current, a hidden river of meaning, and in that river the vow flowed like water, touching everyone who dared to remember, and as he carried sheets of paper warm from the press, he felt as though he were not merely delivering words but breathing that river forward, letting it course into cracks and corners where silence had ruled too long, and sometimes, when he placed a folded pamphlet beneath a loose brick or slid one under the leg of a stool at a tea stall, he imagined the words rising into smoke the instant someone unfolded them, smoke that mingled with the breath of Marcus and Anne and Cale, as if promises never died but only changed form, and the thought both steadied and unsettled him, for if promises could live on, then so could the eyes of the watchers, who seemed to grow thicker in the air around him. Their presence never confirmed yet never in doubt, and he began to recognize them not by faces, for they never showed the same ones twice, but by patterns. The stillness that did not fit the rhythm of the street, the gaze that lingered a fraction too long, the figure that appeared again on a different corner hours later without explanation. And these repetitions knotted into his awareness until he felt them even when he could not see them, a weight in the air behind him, a shadow stretching further than light could explain, and though his heart often quickened, though sweat prickled at the back of his neck when he felt their silence pressing closer, he also discovered within himself a new steadiness, a way of walking with fear without letting it own him, and he realized that this was the vow's truest gift, not the absence of fear but the endurance to carry it without breaking, and with this discovery he walked on, day after day, carrying his bundles, carrying his silence, carrying the vow that seemed now to hum not only in his chest but in the very stones of the street. And the more he walked the more he saw signs that others felt it too, subtle acknowledgments that passed without words, a nod from a stranger that lingered a moment too long, a coin pressed into his palm by an old woman who whispered nothing yet looked at him with eyes that seemed to say, "I know," a boy's laughter cut short into sudden silence as Imran passed, followed by a glance that felt like recognition, and these moments strung themselves together like beads, small and fragile yet forming a chain that bound him to lives he had never touched. And though no one spoke of it aloud, the silence itself had changed, no longer emptiness but a thick fabric woven of endurance and memory, and Imran felt himself both a thread and a weaver, carrying forward something far larger than his own body could contain. And yet alongside this sense of hidden communion grew the undeniable closeness of the watchers, who pressed nearer with every passing week, their silence louder, their stillness sharper, until even in his dreams he felt them, shadows that appeared at the edge of his vision with eyes like mirrors, faces that dissolved whenever he tried to confront them, and he would wake in the night clutching the mat beneath him, his body slick with sweat, whispering the vow into the dark just to steady his breath, and still, each morning, he rose and walked again, because there was no other path, because the vow did not allow retreat, because something larger than himself had claimed him entirely, and though his hands trembled sometimes as he slid a pamphlet into a crack in the wall, though his chest clenched with fear when a shadow lingered too long behind him, though Musa grunted at him for pausing too often mid-task as if distracted, still he carried on. because he had come to see the words not as marks on paper but as living sparks, and sparks did not ask permission to fly. They only sought tinder, and so he became a carrier of sparks, a vessel of fire too small to be noticed and too numerous to be extinguished, and with each passing day he felt the fire spread, felt it breathe in alleys and kitchens and market stalls, felt it hum in the silence of tea shops and in the sudden quiet that fell when certain phrases passed between lips, and though the city wore its mask of sameness. He knew beneath the mask it had already changed, for revolutions did not begin with thunder, they began with whispers that refused to die, and now the whispers had become a chorus too quiet to be named but too steady to be stopped, and though the watchers pressed closer, though their patience was a net tightening around him, Imran understood that nets could catch bodies but not voices, and so he walked lighter, steadier, each step both burden and release, each breath both fear and joy, each moment both ordinary and infinite, until he no longer felt the need to ask when the silence would break, for he knew that when it did, it would not be because of him alone, but because countless unseen hearts had already been breathing the vow into the world, and together they waited, together they endured, together they sharpened themselves in the stillness before the storm, and in this sharpening Imran felt something awaken, not an end but a deepening, as if the vow itself had begun to see through his eyes, to walk through his feet, to breathe through his lungs, and with that awareness he knew that no ember once lit could ever truly die. It only waited for breath, for hands, for hearts willing to keep it alive, and so he walked on, infinite in his smallness, bound to every life before him and every life to come, a single thread in a fabric stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death, and the watchers, though they lingered, though their shadows thickened, could never unweave what had already been woven. Imran did not at first notice the shift in her presence, for she had always been somewhere at the edge of his days, like the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the wooden shutters of Musa's shop, there but never fully claimed. Yet as the weeks lengthened and the vow deepened its hold on his blood, he began to see her differently, not only as the girl who carried baskets of cloth to the stall across the lane or who sometimes came into the shop with a quick word for her uncle before vanishing again, but as someone whose gaze lingered a heartbeat longer than custom allowed, someone who seemed to recognize in him the same fire he had thought hidden beneath silence and ink. And though her name, Aisha, was a simple one carried by many, in his mind it took on the weight of something vast and unspoken, like a song that had always been playing beneath the noise of the city and that he had only now grown quiet enough to hear, and at first their exchanges were nothing more than fragments. Her fingers brushing his as she passed him a roll of paper Musa had asked her to fetch, her eyes lifting toward his when she found him already looking her way, her smile flickering like a candle in a drafty room. But these small sparks gathered, hidden embers in the folds of his days, until one evening, when the press had fallen silent and Musa had gone home muttering about accounts, she lingered, standing among the smell of ink and paper, her shawl loose around her shoulders, and asked softly whether he ever grew tired of carrying words that no one seemed ready to hear, and the question struck him deeper than he expected. For it was not the idle curiosity of someone passing through but the probing of one who had seen the weight in his posture, the fatigue shadowing his face, and he found himself answering in more than half sentences, confessing how each pamphlet felt like a stone dropped into a river whose far shore he could not see, how sometimes he feared the current would swallow them all, and as he spoke she stepped closer, the distance between them closing until he could smell the faint trace of henna on her hands, and she said, almost fiercely, that rivers were made not only of water, but of stones, each one shaping the current in ways unseen, and that perhaps he was not meant to see the far shore, only to keep throwing stones, and something in the certainty of her voice steadied him, as if she had reached into his chest and quieted the storm for a moment, and from that evening forward he could not move through the city without feeling her presence woven into his steps, sometimes in the markets where she bargained with a sharpness that belied her soft laughter, sometimes at the well where she drew water while children clamored around her, sometimes in the press where Musa scolded them both for their slowness, though he eyed them with a knowing suspicion he never voiced, and in stolen moments they began to carve a space out of the city's noise, meeting in the shadowed corners of alleys, exchanging words that meant little on the surface but carried beneath them a current of shared defiance. And once, when the muezzin's call drifted across the rooftops and the streets emptied for prayer, she pressed a folded scrap of cloth into his hand, inside it a tiny embroidered bird, no larger than his thumb, stitched in red and gold, and she whispered that it was to remind him that even in cages, Wings remembered how to move, and he carried it in his pocket thereafter as if it were another vow layered upon the first, and yet for all the sweetness of these moments, a shadow lengthened. For the watchers had grown sharper in their observations, their boots echoing more frequently in the lanes near the press, their eyes scanning the crowds with a hunger that made even laughter falter, and once, while delivering a bundle of papers, Imran caught the gaze of a man standing too still in the corner of a tea-house. His expression blank, but his attention coiled like a snake, and though Imran forced his stride to remain steady, he felt the cold weight of surveillance settle on his back, and he knew then that the vow was no longer only a current within him but a flame others had begun to sense, and with that realization came fear, not only for himself but for Aisha, for in her presence his guard slipped, his heart softened, and he worried that the same eyes tracking him would soon fall upon her. Yet when he tried to pull back, she resisted with a quiet strength, telling him that love was not a weakness but another form of resistance, that to remain human in the face of fear was itself an act of defiance, and though he wanted to shield her from the gathering storm, he could not deny the way her words steadied him in moments when despair threatened to unravel his resolve. And so the city continued to move around them, the markets bursting with color and noise, the alleys echoing with the cries of children, the nights thick with the hum of hidden gatherings where words were whispered like contraband, and within this living tapestry Imran felt both hunted and held, both fragile and unbreakable, for he carried not only the vow but also her touch, her laughter, her fierce belief that Wings remembered flight, and in this mingling of duty and love, of danger and tenderness, the days began to stretch toward something he could not yet name, a horizon where silence would have to break, though when and how remained as uncertain as the shifting of wind across the river. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with friends, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.